Welcome back, everybody. Here is another mini lecture for this week. This one focuses on the second part of Module 2, where we're using the three theories to explain comparative politics. And I just want to give you an example of how we would focus on an outcome, and that's civil war, and use it to, or use the three theories, rather, of comparative politics to explain why civil wars happen. So, just some quick background information, right? When we're talking about civil war, we are talking about some non-state actors. So these are not representatives of the government who are fighting the government, whoever happens to be in charge. And they usually do so for two reasons. One is regime change, which is essentially they want to control the government and be in charge of the country. And the other is secession. So they want to take a piece of land in the country and turn it into their own new country, right? So if we are trying to understand what causes civil wars to happen, and incidentally, you may or may not know this, but civil wars are the predominant form of armed conflict after the end of World War II. Yes, there are definitely interstate wars that are a really big deal. For example, the war between Ukraine and Russia, but the vast majority of conflicts that have taken place since World War II ended have been civil wars. So, we're going to understand why they happen. Rational choice theory would assume that you have some set of actors, right? This can be some kind of a political organization, and they have a goal. Let's say they want to secede. They're a group of people from whom, for example, their ethnicity is particularly important, and so they want to have their own country for their own ethnic group. And so the leaders of this group decide, okay, well, what are our options? We want to achieve this goal. We can run in elections, we can protest, or we can wage a civil war. And rational choice theory would assume that they go through a cost-benefit calculation and they decide that elections, not going to lead to much. Most governments are not going to let you secede for a variety of reasons. Two, right, maybe this group protested, but they were repressed by the government, and so that didn't work. And so they decide the only option left for them is civil war. And so this is how we would look at the decision of organizations to engage in civil war from a rational choice perspective. Next, we're still focused on this idea of civil war, but we're looking at psychological theories. So here we are also focusing on individuals or people in small groups, but we're not thinking about their decision as a cost-benefit calculation. It's exactly the opposite. We're thinking about their personal histories, their backgrounds, their experiences. Maybe, for example, you have a charismatic leader of this organization of said ethnic group, and this person happened to be wrongfully imprisoned by the government. A lot of governments do this to their own people. They repress them, especially in non-democracies. And so maybe this person, right, in this image here, because they were wrongfully imprisoned, like that really influenced their decision. They want to enact revenge. Their group wants to enact revenge. It wasn't just this person who was wrongfully imprisoned, but a whole bunch of people from the same ethnic group. And so we're explaining the decision to engage in civil war due to emotions or other psychological factors. And there has been some work on this. So I included this link to an article by a political scientist at Northwestern named W.W.I.I. Perlman, who wrote, by the way, a fabulous book called We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled about the Syrian Civil War. But her article was about the Arab Spring and the role of emotions and the histories that people had to explain why you saw huge protests in Egypt and Tunisia during the Arab Spring, which happened in, say, like late December of 2010, the spring of 2011. So why there were huge protests in Egypt and Tunisia, which ultimately led to the overthrow of the long-standing dictators there, but not any big protest in Algeria. And in Algeria, kind of spoiler alert here, if you do want to read the article, what W.W.I.I. Perlman argues is that people in Algeria, because they had already experienced a civil war in the 1990s, were just extremely fearful of that happening to them again, right? So we might explain, in this case, Wendy Perlman talks about protests, but we might explain civil wars based on the experiences of people having to do with psychological factors. This is also just a very, very good book. Really easy read. Highly recommend it. Okay, another lens that we're focused on. Here we're explaining Civil War through political culture. So not individuals, nobody's making any cost-benefit calculations, no one's talking about, right, personal backgrounds or histories. We're looking at like cultures of societies. Mia Bloom is a political scientist who wrote a book called Dying to Kill, which you can see here. This is a link to a lecture that she gave at, I want to say Stanford, but I'm not entirely sure, at a university, that talked about this culture of martyrdom and how that influences the decisions of different groups to use violence. So that's what we would be emphasizing in this particular theoretical explanation. Okay, next. We're going to talk about political ideology. We're still wearing those beliefs-based sunglasses, but now we are looking at political ideologies, which are more or less coherent ideas about how the world is and whether it should be changed, and if it should be changed, how it should be changed, right? So here is a quote from Chairman Mao. Now, Mao was in charge of the government, so he did not launch a civil war because civil wars are launched by people who don't represent the government. But there were non-state actors who were influenced by Maoism and used that as their political ideology, and that was their justification for engaging in violence, which is the title of this book here, right? A study of Maoist movements in India. Next, we're moving up our levels of analysis and we're talking about political and economic institutions. So there's actually a huge amount of studies that have looked at this, that have looked at the role of economic development in civil war, and basically the poorer the country, the more likely you are to have a civil war. There are a number of different reasons why, but if we are trying to explain civil war from a structural perspective, again, we're not looking at people, we're not looking at their backgrounds, or do they weigh the costs and benefits, we're not looking at societies and their beliefs and political cultures or their ideologies. We are looking at factors at the country level, such as gross domestic product per capita or GDP per capita, right? We could also look at political institutions. Democracies tend to not have civil wars. So again, if we're thinking about the causes of civil war from a structural perspective, we're looking at countries and the economic and the political characteristics that they have. And that is how we would explain civil war with the three theories of comparative politics. And if you are wondering, I do study political violence, so a lot of the examples that I will bring in over the course of this semester will have to do with things like civil war and ethnic conflict and terrorism, etc.